The clock in the breakfast room at Ashworth House had just struck 9:30 when Eleanor Blackwood, Duchess of Ashworth, set down her teacup and told the housekeeper to have the carriage brought round at 11:15 that evening. Not tomorrow morning, not the following day. Tonight. Mrs. Calloway, who had served the house for 19 years and had learned long ago to hear what was not said as clearly as what was, looked at the Duchess for a moment. Then she nodded once, wrote the instruction in her ledger, and left the room without asking a single question. Eleanor sat alone at the breakfast table for another 4 minutes. She counted them. The toast had gone cold. The butter had not been touched. The letter from her husband's secretary lay open beside her plate, and the relevant line, the one that had changed the shape of the evening, the week, the marriage, was a single sentence near the bottom of the page. His Grace requests that a third place be set at the anniversary dinner this evening. A guest will be arriving at 8. Eleanor read it once. She read it again. She folded the letter along its original crease, placed it beneath her saucer, where it would leave a faint ring on the paper, and finished her tea. The tea was Darjeeling. She had been ordering it from the same supplier in Piccadilly for 6 years, because it was the blend her husband preferred, and because in the early years of their marriage she had taken a private, unspoken pleasure in knowing exactly what he wanted before he thought to ask. She set the cup down. The porcelain made a sound against the saucer that was barely audible, and the breakfast room, with its south-facing windows and its view of the November garden where the last of the roses had gone to frost 3 days ago, was perfectly still. The marriage of Lord Edward Blackwood, 6th Duke of Ashworth, and Miss Eleanor Graves, only daughter of Sir William Graves of Hertfordshire, had taken place 7 years ago at St. George's, Hanover Square, on the 14th of June. It had rained, not heavily, a fine, persistent mist that settled on the shoulders of the guests and turned the flagstones dark. Eleanor had worn her mother's veil, which was 2 inches too long, and which she had not altered because her mother had died, wearing it at precisely that length, and Eleanor was not going to be the one to cut it. She was 20 when they married. Edward was 28. He was tall and dark-haired and moved through rooms with the particular ease of a man who had never once entered a space and wondered whether he belonged there. She had loved him. She would be precise about this because precision was the only thing she had left that was entirely her own. She had loved him from the afternoon she first saw him at Lady Pemberton's garden party, standing at the edge of the lawn with a glass of wine he was not drinking, watching a game of croquet he was not playing, and she had thought, with a clarity that surprised her even then, that man is the loneliest person in this garden, and he does not know it yet. They had been introduced. They had spoken for 11 minutes. He had asked her about a book she was carrying, Herodotus, which she had brought because she expected the party to be dull and had not yet learned to hide her preparations for boredom. And he had laughed, not at her, with her, at the absurdity of bringing a Greek historian to a croquet party, and something in the way he laughed, openly, without performance, the laughter of a man who was genuinely surprised by delight, had settled into her chest like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. 7 years, 2,555 days, she had counted, not out of sentiment, out of the habit of a woman who had managed this house, this estate, this life, with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that if she did not count, no one would. The house itself was a Georgian pile in Mayfair, 4 stories of Portland stone, and tall windows that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the drawing room glow amber for exactly 40 minutes between 3 and 4 o'clock from October to March. Eleanor knew this because she had timed it during her first winter as Duchess, alone in the house while Edward was at his club or at Parliament, or at whatever it was that kept him away from 4 in the afternoon until midnight with increasing regularity as the years advanced. She had not complained. She was not built for complaint. She was built for management, for competence, for the quiet architecture of a life that ran so smoothly that the man at its center never once had to wonder how the fires were lit, how the accounts were balanced, how the tenants were managed, how the garden was planned 3 seasons ahead, how the staff were paid on time and treated with the precise combination of firmness and warmth that kept a household of 14 running without friction. She did all of this. She had always done all of this. And Edward, who was not a cruel man and not a stupid man, but who had inherited from his father the particular blindness of men who have always been served and have therefore never learned to see service, had never once in 7 years asked her how any of it was done. She did not resent this. Or rather, she had trained herself not to resent it, which is a different thing entirely, and which costs more than most people understand. The woman's name was Cecily Ashton. Eleanor knew this because she was not a fool, and because London was not as large as the men who conducted their affairs within it seemed to believe. Mrs. Cecily Ashton, widow of Captain James Ashton, who had died at sea in 1811 and left her with a modest house in Chelsea, a wardrobe that exceeded her income by a factor of 3, and a face that turned heads in the way that faces do when they are designed not for beauty exactly, but for a kind of vivid, restless animation that made the people around her feel dull by comparison. Eleanor had first heard the name 14 months ago. She had heard it from her own lady's maid, who had heard it from Edward's valet, who had mentioned it without thinking in the way that servants sometimes do when they assume the household already knows what the household already knows. Eleanor had received this information the way she received all information, quietly, completely, and with immediate practical assessment. She did not confront Edward. She did not weep. She did not write to her sister. She sat in the morning room with her household ledger open on her lap, and she thought about it for a long time. And what she thought was this: I have been managing everything in this marriage except the one thing that cannot be managed, and now I must decide what I am willing to live without. She had decided, that morning 14 months ago, that she was willing to live without certainty. She was willing to live without exclusive claim. She was willing to live, as her mother had lived, and her grandmother before her, in the particular silence of women who knew and did not speak, because speaking would require them to act, and acting would require them to leave, and leaving would mean losing the house, the garden, the library, the life they had built with their own hands, while the men whose names were on the deeds were elsewhere, being adored. But a third-place setting at their anniversary dinner, that was different. That was not discretion, that was declaration. That was Edward Blackwood telling his wife, on the evening that marked 7 years of marriage, that the woman he kept in Chelsea was welcome at their table, in their dining room, under the chandelier that Eleanor had commissioned from a craftsman in Bath, because the original had been damaged in a storm, and Edward had not noticed for 4 months, because Edward did not look up. She read the letter one more time. A guest will be arriving at 8. She placed it back beneath the saucer. She rang for Mrs. Calloway a second time and asked very calmly for the following things: her gray traveling dress to be pressed, her jewelry case to be brought down, and a letter to be sent to her sister in Hertfordshire, informing her that Eleanor would be arriving late tonight, and would she please have the east bedroom made up. Mrs. Calloway listened. Mrs. Calloway's face did not change, but her hand, the one holding the ledger, tightened at the knuckle, and Eleanor saw it. And for one brief moment, something passed between the two women that was not spoken, and did not need to be. Then Mrs. Calloway left, and Eleanor was alone again, and the morning light through the south-facing windows fell across the breakfast table in a way that made the cold toast look almost golden. The day passed. Eleanor spent it the way she spent every day, precisely, competently, and with the particular calm that comes when a decision has already been made, and the only thing remaining is the execution. She reviewed the weekly accounts with the steward at 10. The household expenditure for November was running £4 under budget, because Eleanor had renegotiated the coal contract in September, when she noticed that the previous supplier had been incrementally raising prices by a shilling a delivery for the past 8 months. She had not told Edward about this. She had not told Edward about most things because telling Edward required first getting Edward's attention, which required interrupting whatever Edward was doing, which was usually something he considered more important, and after 7 years she had stopped competing with his schedule for access to his awareness. She wrote 3 letters, one to the tenant at Birchwood Farm about the drainage that had been failing since September, one to the linen supplier in Oxford Street about an overcharge she had identified in last month's invoice, one to the gardener about the spring bulbs she wanted ordered before December. She sealed each one with the Ashworth crest, which she pressed into the wax with the same signet ring she had used for every piece of correspondence since becoming Duchess, and she thought, as she pressed it, about the 347 letters she had written on behalf of this estate in the past year alone. She had counted, not because anyone asked, not because no one did. She walked the garden at noon, as she always did, checking the state of the beds and the progress of the winter pruning. The head gardener, Morris, walked beside her and reported on the condition of the south wall espalier, which was producing well despite the cold autumn, and the state of the greenhouse heating, which needed a new pipe fitted before the first hard frost. Eleanor listened, asked 2 precise questions, approved the expenditure for the pipe, and returned to the house by 12:30. The garden was her closest thing to a conversation, not with Morris, who was competent and kind, but not a confidant, with the garden itself. She had redesigned it in her second year as Duchess, after discovering that the previous arrangement, Edward's mother's design, formal and symmetrical and deeply unimaginative, was wasting the south-facing aspect and ignoring the natural drainage patterns of the site. She had spent 4 months studying the soil composition, the light angles, the wind patterns, and she had drawn up a new plan in her own hand on a sheet of drafting paper she had purchased from a shop on the Strand that sold materials to architects. The garden now produced cut flowers for every room in the house from April to October, herbs for the kitchen year-round, and fruit from the espalier that cook used in preserves that the household consumed through the winter. Eleanor had done all of this. She had done it without asking permission, without requesting funds from Edward's accounts, without mentioning it until it was finished and thriving and undeniable. Edward had walked through it once on a Sunday afternoon in June and said, "The garden looks well." 4 words. She had planted 900 bulbs. She ate lunch alone. She had eaten lunch alone for approximately 4 years, which was the point at which Edward had stopped returning home for the midday meal with any regularity, and she had long since stopped setting a second place because the sight of the empty chair had become worse than the fact of his absence. There had been a moment, she remembered now, 3 years ago, a Wednesday in February, when Edward had come home unexpectedly at noon. He had stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the single place setting, and something had crossed his face. Not guilt, not sadness. Something more like surprise, as if he had not realized until that moment that his absence had become so consistent that his wife had adjusted the table to accommodate it. He had sat down. He had asked cook to prepare a second plate. They had eaten together in near silence for 20 minutes, and then he had reached across the table and placed his hand over hers and said, "I should do this more often." She had looked at his hand on hers. She had felt the warmth of it, the familiar weight, the particular callus on his right palm from riding that she had known since the first year of their marriage. And she had thought, "You should, and you will not. And I will continue to eat alone, and I will continue to manage the house and the garden and the accounts and the staff and your correspondence and your tenants and your reputation, and I will do all of this in the silence you have made comfortable for yourself, because you have never had to sit inside it." He had not come home for lunch again after that Wednesday. She had not been surprised. She had simply removed the second chair from the room entirely, because it was easier to eat at a table with one chair than at a table with one chair and one absence. At 2 o'clock, she sat in the morning room and read. Not Herodotus. She had not read Herodotus since the early years, since the time when she still believed that the things she loved about herself, her intelligence, her curiosity, her appetite for difficult ideas, were the things Edward had married her for. She understood now that he had married her for her competence and her calm and her willingness to run his life without requiring him to participate in the running of it, and that the Herodotus had been, for him, a charming eccentricity rather than a window into who she actually was. She was reading a treatise on land management by Arthur Young, because the Ashworth estate in Wiltshire was underperforming, and she suspected the tenant arrangements needed restructuring, and she was not going to wait for Edward's land agent, who was 63 and resistant to change, to arrive at the same conclusion she had reached 6 months ago. She made notes in the margins in her small, precise hand. She would leave the book on Edward's desk when she left tonight. It was the last act of management she would perform for this house, and she wanted it to be useful. At 5 o'clock, she went upstairs and began to dress, not for the dinner, for the departure. She chose the gray traveling dress because it was warm and practical, and because gray was the color she disappeared into most easily, which was useful when one was leaving a house one had run for 7 years without anyone noticing and wanted to do so without performance or spectacle. She packed one trunk. She was a woman who had learned to travel with one trunk, because she had learned over 7 years to need very little that she could not carry herself. She placed inside it 2 changes of dress, her writing case, her personal ledger, the miniature portrait of her mother that had sat on her dressing table since she arrived at Ashworth House as a bride, and the book of household accounts she had kept in her own hand since the first month of her marriage. She did not pack the pearl necklace Edward had given her on their first anniversary. She did not pack the emerald earrings from their third. She did not pack any of the jewelry he had given her because the jewelry belonged to the Ashworth estate, and she was leaving the Ashworth estate, and she was going to leave it clean. Everything she was taking fit in one trunk. She had arrived with more than this. She was leaving with less. The arithmetic of it was simple and devastating, and she did not allow herself to dwell on it for longer than the time it took to close the latch. At 7:30, Edward came home. She heard the front door from the upstairs landing. She heard his boots on the marble, the particular rhythm of his walk, always slightly faster than necessary, because he moved through the world as though the world should keep up with him rather than the other way round. She heard him speak to the footman. She heard him ask whether the Duchess was dressed. She stood at the top of the staircase and looked down at him and felt something that she had not allowed herself to feel for 14 months, which was the full, unbearable weight of loving someone who had not learned to see her. He looked up. He was wearing his evening clothes. He looked, she thought, with a precision that was almost medical, exactly as handsome as he had looked at Lady Pemberton's garden party 7 years ago, and exactly as distant, and exactly as lonely. And the difference was that she now understood that the loneliness she had seen in him that afternoon was not a wound she could heal. It was a room he carried with him, and he had chosen to furnish it with someone else. He smiled at her. It was not a false smile. That was the part that was hardest. It was a genuine, warm, distracted smile, the smile of a man who was fond of his wife and had not yet understood that fondness and love are not the same thing, and that one of them was no longer enough. "You look well," he said. "Thank you," she said. She descended the staircase, one step at a time. Dinner was set for 3. The dining room, which Eleanor had redecorated 2 years ago with wallpaper she had chosen from a sample book in a shop on Regent Street while Edward was in the country, was lit by 42 candles. She had counted them once, early in the marriage, because she liked to know the cost of light. The table was dressed with the Ashworth silver, which she had inventoried and polished schedule she had personally established. And the flowers, white roses, because they were her preference, and because she had always chosen the flowers in this house, were arranged in the low crystal vase that had been a wedding gift from Edward's mother, who was dead now, and who had told Eleanor on the morning of the wedding, with a calm that Eleanor had not understood at the time, "He will not be easy, but the house will need you more than he knows." Mrs. Cecily Ashton arrived at 10 minutes past 8. She was wearing blue. She was beautiful in the way that Eleanor had expected, not quietly, not modestly, but with a kind of deliberate, unashamed radiance that filled the doorway and made the hallway feel smaller. Edward introduced her as a friend of the family. Eleanor shook her hand. The hand was warm and slightly damp, which meant she was nervous, which meant she had not known that she would be dining with the wife, which meant Edward had not told her, which meant this performance of civilized inclusion was not an agreement between conspirators, but a test, Edward's test, to see how far his wife's composure would stretch before it broke. Eleanor's composure did not break. It had been tested by harder things than a beautiful woman in a blue dress. It had been tested by 14 months of knowing and 7 years of building and a lifetime of being the kind of woman who was easy to rely on and easy to overlook, and she was finished, tonight, with being both. They sat. The first course was served. White soup, which cook had prepared because Eleanor had planned the menu 3 days ago, before the letter, before the third place setting, before any of this. She had chosen it because it was Edward's favorite, and because she had spent 7 years learning his preferences and encoding them into the rhythms of the household so thoroughly that the house itself now catered to him automatically, like a machine she had built and wound and set running so precisely that it would continue for weeks after she left before anyone noticed the hand that had maintained it was gone. The conversation was careful and bright and carried almost entirely by Edward, who was good at this, good at filling rooms with the sound of his own confidence, good at making awkward situations feel managed, good at performing ease while the two women on either side of him sat in different qualities of silence. Eleanor's silence was the silence of someone who has already made every decision that matters and is simply waiting for the clock to reach the time she has specified. She watched Edward talk. She watched him lean toward Cecily when he poured her wine, a small inclination of the body, unconscious, gravitational, the way a plant turns toward light. She watched Cecily receive it, and she felt, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, the precise moment at which the last thread of hope she had been carrying without admitting it, the hope that he would look across the table and see what he was doing and stop, went slack. He was not going to stop. He was not going to see. He was going to sit at this table, under the chandelier she had commissioned, eating the meal she had planned, drinking the wine she had selected from the cellar she had organized, and he was going to smile at the woman in blue and not once consider that everything around him, the warmth, the light, the silver, the smooth and frictionless comfort of his entire existence, had been built by the woman in gray sitting 3 feet away, watching him with steady eyes and a heart that was at last finished. Cecily's silence was different. It was the silence of a woman who was beginning to understand, course by course, that something was wrong, that the wife across the table was not angry or wounded or performing dignity, but was simply, terrifyingly, calm. Eleanor saw the moment Cecily understood. It was between the first course and the second, during a pause in Edward's monologue about a debate in the Commons that neither woman had asked about. Cecily looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back. And in that look, steady, unhurried, without malice or competition, Eleanor communicated something that took Cecily approximately 4 seconds to receive. I am not your enemy. I am not even your rival. I am the woman who built everything you see around you, and I am leaving it tonight, and what you do with what remains is between you and the man who never learned to see what he had. Cecily's hand moved to her wineglass. She did not drink from it. She held it. Her fingers were trembling slightly. Eleanor noticed this and felt, unexpectedly, something close to compassion, because Cecily Ashton was about to inherit a household she did not know how to run, and a man she did not know how to see, and the education ahead of her was going to be long and painful, and Eleanor was not going to be there to watch it. The second course came. Roast pheasant. Eleanor ate precisely, noted that the sauce was slightly over-reduced, made a mental note to speak to cook about it tomorrow, and then remembered that she would not be here tomorrow and felt the first true stab of grief, not for the husband, not for the marriage, but for the kitchen, for the garden, for the staff she had trained, for the house she had made into something that worked, for the life she had built with her own 2 hands while the man at the head of the table was looking somewhere else. She thought about Mrs. Calloway, who would manage in her absence because Mrs. Calloway was competent and loyal and had watched Eleanor work for 7 years with the quiet attention of a woman who was learning everything she could from a master. She thought about Morris, who would keep the garden alive. She thought about Cook, who would continue to make the white soup and the pheasant and the Darjeeling tea exactly the way Eleanor had taught her, and Edward would eat it all and drink it all and never once ask who had established the recipes, the schedules, the suppliers, the systems that made his comfort possible. She set down her fork. She placed her napkin beside her plate. She looked at Edward. I have enjoyed the evening, she said. Her voice was level, but my carriage is waiting, and I will be leaving now. The room changed, not loudly. The way a room changes when the air pressure drops before a storm. Something shifts in the quality of the silence, in the way the candlelight falls, in the distance between the people sitting in it. Edward looked at her. Leaving? He said. For the night, she said. And for however long after that seems right. She stood. She did not look at Cecily. Cecily was not the point. Cecily had never been the point. The point was the third place setting. The point was a man who loved his wife enough to smile at her every evening, and not enough to see that she had been holding the entire architecture of their life together with her bare hands for 7 years, and that she had finally, on this cold November evening, set it down. She walked to the door. Behind her she heard the sound of Edward's chair moving. She heard him stand. She heard him say her name, Eleanor, and she stopped. Not because he asked, because she wanted to hear how he said it. He said it the way he said everything, with warmth, with confidence, with the assumption that the sound of his voice would be enough to make her stay, because it always had been. She turned. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. "You are a good man, Edward," she said, "but you have never once asked me how the fires are lit." And she saw it, the first crack. Not understanding, not yet, but the beginning of it. The faintest flicker of something in his eyes that looked like the moment before a man realizes he has been standing in a room full of evidence and has not read a single page. She did not wait for him to speak. She walked through the hallway. The trunk was already loaded. Mrs. Calloway was standing at the door with her traveling coat and her gloves and a look on her face that was not pity and not triumph, but something closer to recognition. One woman seeing another woman do the thing she had decided to do, cleanly and completely and without apology. The carriage moved through Mayfair and out toward the northern road. The streets were wet. November rain, fine and persistent, the same kind of rain that had fallen on her wedding day. And Eleanor sat in the dark interior, with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and her face turned toward the window, where the lamplights of London moved past like small, distant fires being left behind one by one. She did not cry. She would cry later, she suspected. She would cry at her sister's house, in the east bedroom, in the dark, when there was no one to perform composure for, and no household to manage, and no garden to walk, and no ledger to balance, and nothing between herself and the full weight of what she had built and what she had lost. But not now. Now she was in motion, and motion had its own kind of discipline. The carriage passed Hyde Park Corner. It passed the last of the lit streets. The city fell away behind her and the road opened ahead, dark and quiet. And she thought about the morning room at Ashworth House and the way the light came through the south windows at 4 o'clock, amber and warm, falling across the desk where she wrote her letters and kept her accounts and did the daily, invisible, uncounted work of making a life run. She thought about the garden, the espalier on the south wall, the spring bulbs she had ordered 3 hours ago that she would not be there to see bloom. She thought about Morris, the gardener, who would wonder where she was and who would, she hoped, continue the pruning schedule she had established, because it was a good schedule and the garden deserved continuity even if the marriage did not. She breathed. The air in the carriage was cold. Outside, the November night was black and still, and the rain had stopped, and the road ahead was long, and she was, for the first time in 7 years, not responsible for anyone's comfort but her own. The arithmetic of it was strange. 7 years of building, 1 evening of leaving. A trunk that held less than she arrived with, and a silence that was not empty but full of every unasked question, every unnoticed act, every fire lit, and ledger balanced, and garden tended, and meal planned, and account settled in the quiet, competent, magnificent labor of a woman who had run an empire and called it a marriage. She thought about what Edward would find in the morning, the household ledger on her desk, updated through December, the coal contract filed in the 3rd drawer, the gardener's schedule pinned inside the pantry door, the Arthur Young treatise on his desk with her notes in the margins. She had left everything in order because she could not leave it any other way, because order was who she was, because the house deserved to run smoothly even if the man who owned it did not deserve the woman who had made it so. She thought about Mrs. Calloway, standing at the door with her coat and her gloves and that look of recognition, and she thought, that is enough. One woman seeing another woman clearly. That is enough to leave on. Eleanor Blackwood closed her eyes. The carriage moved north through the dark, and behind her, in the dining room of Ashworth House, 42 candles burned in a room that was, for the first time in 7 years, going to have to learn how to run without her. The wax would pool, the flames would gutter. And by morning, when the light came through the south-facing windows at 4 o'clock and fell amber and warm across the empty desk in the morning room where no one was sitting and no letters were being written, and no accounts were being balanced, the house would begin, slowly and imperfectly and with considerable difficulty, to understand what it had lost. But that was no longer her concern. She was on the road. She was in motion, and the silence around her was her own.